I suppose the story of Micaiah and his vision of heaven is probably the vision of heaven that I bypass more than any of the others, which is kind of a strange thing because Micaiah's vision is at least as fascinating as any of the others. I suppose it's because Micaiah is, comparatively speaking, you might say a minor character. I don't especially like terminology like that, but this is the only time that he appears in the Bible. Here in the telling of this story in 1 Kings chapter 22 and the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 18, Micaiah doesn't appear in the text anywhere else, which doesn't compare very favorably to, say, the Apostle Paul or the Apostle John or the prophet Elijah or the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Ezekiel, etc. There's no book named after Micaiah. There's no follow-up to this. There's no story of his birth or his death or anything like that. He just appears this one time and then disappears. But in the entire text of the Bible that we have, in all of these visions of heaven that we're looking at, this one really stands apart. It's unlike anything that we see and brings up, probably as is the case, I suppose you might say, with the other visions as well, brings up more questions than it answers questions. Nevertheless, a very interesting insight into the way God deals with humanity, the way that God communicates with humanity, and especially the way that we listen and the way that we respond to his communication. If you don't know the story, what's going on here, and I'm going to be reading in First Kings rather, chapter 22. Micaiah is a prophet in the court of King Ahab of the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab is allied with his son-in-law Jehoshaphat, who reigns in Jerusalem and Judah, and they are going to go to war together against Aram or Syria. And Ahab wants to consult with his court prophets, which I suppose is a thing. And he does so, and they all tell him to go ahead, and it's going to be great. And Jehoshaphat clearly he's a man of faith, and his father-in-law's attachment to the idols of the foreign lands is clearly disturbing to him, at least to a certain degree. And he is not satisfied with this measure of communication. Either he doesn't have any confidence that these are real prophets of God, or that they're not even trying to be prophets of God. However it works, he wants to hear it from somebody else. He wants to hear from a prophet of Yahweh himself. And Ahab says there isn't a prophet that you would call a prophet around today, except for this fellow Micaiah, who is here, but I don't like talking to him because he never tells me what I want to hear. And that, of course, opens up a whole can of worms with regard to the reason why we have prophets in the first place and the reason that we listen to them. Why is it that we would just surround ourselves with yes men? Is it really worth the effort, etc.? And we're not going to get into a whole bunch of that here today. But at any rate, this sounds like Jehoshaphat's kind of man. So he asks that Micaiah be brought in, and Micaiah, his initial response is basically to do the same thing everybody else is doing. And sure, go, it'll be fine. And it appears, although the text doesn't say so specifically, that he's doing so in such a way as to make it obvious that he's not being sincere, because Ahab calls him on this and says, I've told you only to speak the truth, which is kind of an interesting thing because, of course, Ahab has been avoiding calling him specifically because he didn't want to hear the truth, but whatever. And so then we see, starting in verse number 17, Micaiah basically says he's going to tell the truth. Micaiah said, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and the Lord said, they have no master. Let everyone return home to his place. So the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, didn't I tell you that he never prophesies good about me, but only disaster? And Micaiah said, as if to say, I'm just getting started. You haven't heard the best of it yet. Verse 19, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne. And here's the actual vision. And the whole heavenly army was standing by him at his right hand and at his left hand. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab to march up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? So one was saying this and another was saying that. Then a spirit came forward, stood in the Lord's presence, and said, I will entice him. The Lord asked him, how? He said, I will go and become a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then he said, you will certainly entice him and prevail. Go and do that. You see, the Lord has put a lying spirit into the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has pronounced disaster against you. Then Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, came up, hit Micaiah on the cheek, and demanded, Did the Spirit of the Lord leave you to did the Spirit of the Lord leave me to speak to you? Micaiah replied, You will soon see when you go to hide in an inner chamber on that day. Then the king of Israel ordered, Take Micaiah and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, This is what the king says, put this guy in prison, and feed him only with a little bread and water until I come back safely. But Micaiah said, If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me. Then he said, Listen, all you people. All right, now, obviously there is a lot in that. And equally obvious, I would think it would be fair to say, we're not going to be able to understand all of this. But I do want to take a few lessons from this entire story here, and especially this quest for the message of God, and the notion of God sending a lying spirit to Ahab's prophets, and exactly how literal all of this is, and on and on we could go. I will tell you right up front, and I can say this with pretty much all of the other visions that we get of God in the Bible. If you think that you know everything there is to know about this story, I think you are delusional. In all fairness and all kindness, I don't think that is a reasonable position for us to put ourselves in. What's more, I would say if you are listening to the teachings of someone who says that he knows everything about this, I think you should run away. I think you should get away from that teacher, because there are clearly things about God and God's work, and especially God's work in heavenly realms, that we as human beings cannot possibly understand. And I want to make sure that we grasp that general concept before we start digging into what actually is or is not going on in the halls of heaven here in this particular place. I am not in position to say exactly how literal this vision is, any more than how literal the story of the rich man and Lazarus is, or how literal the pearly gates and such are that John sees in Revelation, etc., etc. I don't think that's the point. I think the point of these visions, all of them, is not to communicate what heaven is like, but rather to communicate a further message for us while we're on earth waiting for heaven. And one of the big lessons that we should take away from this entire story, is this idea of a quest for wisdom. That there is a wisdom that comes from God that is unlike anything that you're going to find in any other place. And our initial reaction to that oftentimes is to push it away, simply because it is different, because it is unusual. We don't like being lectured in general, and we certainly don't like being lectured by an absentee authority figure who most of the time doesn't even take the time and bother to explain himself. He just says, this is the way it is, and leaves it. And we're supposed to believe that. We're supposed to accept that. And that's especially true, of course, when God seems to be telling us things that we don't want to hear. And that's where Ahab finds himself in this position. He's consulting with everybody, as long as those people will tell him what he wants to hear. And again, you wonder why you even bother doing something like that. If you're only going to listen to people who tickle your ears, then why bother listening to anybody? It's self-delusion, basically. You're filtering out your inputs so that you only hear what you already believed. That's a very narrow, a very shallow way of looking at the world in a general sense, whether you're talking about politics, or you're talking about economics, you're talking about social sciences, or anything. And certainly it's true with regard to the things of God. When we should readily acknowledge we don't understand spiritual truths. The only way we could possibly understand spiritual truths is by allowing God to tell us about spiritual truths. Paul expounds on that in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, comparing the natural man and the spiritual man. No one knows the things of God except as he's revealed them through his spirit. We should accept that. Now, I don't think Ahab is really at his core a person of faith anyway. And so that interferes with that process. But you and I should be able to embrace the idea of an overlord, a authority figure, a king, who is always right and who never needs our help with regard to figuring things out. I'm aware that there are stories in the Bible where God seems to kind of consult with humans and ask what we think about this, that, or the other. But I think that we should, well, I firmly believe, you may or may not agree with me, I firmly believe that that is done for our benefit to make us feel like we're part of the process because we need to be part of the process. None of it is intended to make God look any less wise than he actually is. We see many, many times the wisdom and the authority and the grandeur of God extolled for us to the extent of excluding any kind of valuable human input to go on top of that. Isaiah chapter 40 and verses 15 and 16 talks about how no one has been the counselor of the Lord. He is inscrutable with his knowledge, with his wisdom. No one is able to raise his hand and say, hey, you know what? I think I'm smarter than God in this particular area. Let me chime in here for a second and get us right back on track. Nobody can do that. Plenty of people have tried, obviously, over the years. Zedekiah is one of these people here, apparently. And maybe Ahab could fit in that category as well. Maybe you and I sometimes flirt with that notion. We should be able to back up from that, though, and acknowledge that God is in charge of this communication process. Everything that God says is said with a purpose, and everything that he doesn't say, for whatever reason, we're better off not hearing it. And certainly we're not any worse off for not having heard it. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse number 20 talks about the secret things that have been reserved for God and those things that he has communicated, he has given to us through his prophets. And what a blessing that is, that we are able to look, to a certain degree at least, into the mind of God, and how silly it is for us to imagine that somehow if we were to dig a little deeper on our own, we might get smarter than we actually are, that we might figure out something about God that God has not informed us of. And obviously, it should go without saying at least, that some aspects of God's character, of God's power, of God's sovereignty, etc., do not appear on the surface in the Bible stories that we tell to our kindergartners and things like that. Sometimes things are hidden, they need to be dug for. I love the language in Job chapter 28 where we're digging for wisdom. We're just going everywhere trying to find it, and it seems so elusive for us. That process is not a waste of time, as long as we acknowledge that God ultimately is the only one who can tell us about himself. And the only way we can know God is by listening to God ultimately. If we can grasp that, if we can grasp that he is the only source of true wisdom, then we're going to be much better off. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. That's where it all starts. That phrase is used any number of times, especially in the wisdom literature. And what a blessing it is for us to have access, however limited it may be, to that knowledge. And I realize that Micaiah is kind of a weird example here, where access to that knowledge leaves us scratching our head. How in the world can it be that this honest God is sending a lying spirit? Or it says there that no one is God's counselor, but he's looking for counselors here. He's looking for people to come in, or spirits rather, to come in and tell him what to do. He can't make up his mind, etc. Well, we can speculate all day long, but let's not get too lost in the weeds with regard to this. The important thing in all of this, and surely this is one of the main lessons that we're supposed to get from the Ahab and Micaiah story. The lesson is to listen to what God has to say, and not just listen to him, of course, but to take heed. Listen, all you people, is the last phrase that we read there from verse number 28. Whether Ahab listens or not, whether your government listens or not, whether your parents listened or not, you listen. You pay attention to what God has to say and learn the wisdom that he is trying to teach you, however obscure, however confusing, or however contradictory it may seem to be. Can it possibly be that I'm supposed to answer a fool as his folly deserves, and I'm also supposed to not answer a fool according to his folly? Well, God says yes. Well, how do I do that? Well, you're going to need to work on it for a while, probably. You're going to need to study for a while. You're going to look at other things that God says about fools and about speaking and about not speaking, etc. But you can do it. God, the wisdom that he offers to you is worth having. Don't feel like you're going to unravel all of it. But, then again, that's kind of the fun of it. That's the challenge of it. Knowing that every day of our lives, we're going to be digging for wisdom, and we're going to be digging in the same place and finding it, because God promises that he's going to reveal it to us. Now, closely related to that, I wanted to talk about the plan of God. and the agenda that we place in front of God and ask him to cooperate with, as it were. And Ahab is a great example of this. Ahab is not what you might call an unbeliever. Ahab has not quit on God entirely. All of his children are named with God honoring names, etc. There, it's not that he has completely abandoned Yahweh worship. It's that he has corrupted it with all these idols from the foreign lands. He's not prioritizing the things of God. Ultimately, he doesn't trust in God. And I would like to think that we all agree on this, that the one without the other really isn't worth very much. There are plenty of people out there who acknowledge God in some general sort of sense, but are not going to listen to what he has to say. They're not going to trust him for guidance in their lives. And the reason oftentimes is exactly what Ahab's reason is. Ahab is too busy doing his own things to trust in God. Now, the irony is the best way for Ahab to do what he's trying to do is to trust in God. Ahab wants a solid, stable kingdom. He wants something to hand down to his children. And ironically, that to a certain degree, at least, that's what God gives him. After one of his horrible incidents in chapter 21 with Naboth, and how rebellious he is and selfish and sinful, etc. He comes to repentance, at least to a form of repentance. And when Elijah confronts him on this, he repents, and God extends his kingdom. God allows him and his family to stay on the throne. If that had been Ahab's rule all the time, then he could have gotten that assurance much earlier. He could have been blessed in his own life. If his children had fallen in his footsteps, they would have been blessed, etc. But the ultimate problem, of course, is with Ahab and with the rest of us as well, is that we don't trust in God for that, because it doesn't seem like God is giving us a shortcut, an easy path to what we want in this life. And that is not a failure of perception on our part. If we think that trusting in God is going to cause us to be humble, is going to cause us to limit ourselves somehow, to give somebody else the glory instead of hogging it all for ourselves, that's true. That's absolutely at the core of all of this. Serving God is all about honoring him and praising him, not praising ourselves. Ahab has a problem with that. A lot of humans, frankly, have a problem with that. I'm sure you and I struggle with that from time to time as well. But hopefully people of faith are able to push past this and acknowledge God's sovereignty and God's rules. And whether God has a plan that coincides with our plan or not, we recognize the superiority of his plan, and we pursue his plan. Now, when you're in a position like Ahab, when you have an agenda of your own that doesn't necessarily coincide with God's agenda, you wind up bumping into people who are trying to help you, and you try to run them over instead of helping them out. We see this with Ahab and Elijah, especially. Chapter 18, verse 17, he calls Elijah the troubler of Israel, which is an ironic and interesting expression there. He really thinks, he genuinely believes that all of the problems with this drought that the nation has had for 3 years is because of Elijah. And in a sense, it is. Elijah called for the drought. God gave him the drought. If Elijah had not done that, maybe there wouldn't have been a drought. I don't know. But Elijah is aligned with God's plan. Elijah is trying to bring Ahab and the nation to repentance, trying to emphasize to them that trusting in Baal and these foreign gods is not going to get you what you want in any sense. And to prove that, he's going to take everything that they want from them. And Ahab sees that as a problem and sees Elijah as a problem. Again, it's not that he's quit on God entirely. He believes that Elijah has a pipeline to heavenly realms, and he's determined to shut that pipeline down. Maybe if I could just eliminate Elijah, Yahweh would quit doing all these horrible things to me, to the nation, etc. Well, that is the kind of tunnel vision, that's the kind of narrow-mindedness that we suffer when we get obsessed with our own plan, our own agenda, rather than God's. In chapter 19, you're probably well aware of the showdown at the end of chapter 18 at Mount Carmel, and how God is proved to be superior to the Baal, and Elijah the prophet is superior to the prophets of Baal, and they are brought to this horrible defeat. Ahab is brought down low, and this is an opportunity for repentance. This is an opportunity for faith and for growth. But instead, he, driven by his wife Jezebel, are determined to kill Elijah for all of this. which may seem to you and me to be an unreasonable reaction, but nevertheless, again, Elijah is the problem, and Jezebel wants him dead, and because of that, Ahab wants him dead as well. How sad that is that we can't embrace God on his own terms. We see in chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, that Ahab said to Elijah there in verse number 20, "So, my enemy, you found me, have you?" He replied, "I have found you because you devoted yourself to do what is evil in the Lord's sight." He thinks that Elijah is the enemy. And oftentimes that's the case when we're caught in our trespasses, as it were. Nathan points his finger at us and says, "Thou art the man." Paul talks about this in Galatians chapter 4. "Have I become your enemy because I've told you the truth?" That is a challenge for us to embrace God's plan instead of our own plan. And if we don't do that, then we're never going to get on track. If we're so caught up with our own agenda, our financial agenda, our social agenda, our whatever it happens to be, education, popularity, that will distract us from the things of God. Now, we're told that we can, to a certain degree, have our cake and eat it too. Jesus says in Matthew 6, verse 33, that if you seek the kingdom first, all these things will be added to you. Now, all these things is not talking about everything you could possibly want every day of your life for the rest of your life. That's not what he's saying, of course. He's saying, though, that if you prioritize me, if you prioritize spiritual issues, I'll take care of the rest of this. That requires faith. And Ahab is not up to the challenge in this particular case. Maybe by studying about Ahab and Micaiah, we can find that faith in ourselves and grow that faith. I want to talk about the nature of truth here, and I want to come back to this idea of the lying prophets and God's relationship with truth. And we see in many, many places God essentially being seen as almost synonymous with truth, that it is part of his character to tell the truth. He's incapable of telling a lie. 3 times in the New Testament, we're told that God cannot lie. So what's going on with the lies that are going on coming from the throne of heaven? You might expect me to quibble here and say, well, technically, God's not the one telling a lie. Technically, it's not even the Spirit that's telling a lie. The Spirit is going to go down and sow a spirit of inaccuracy, you might say. You may call that a lie, I guess. That he's going to tell the prophets, and they're going to tell Ahab, and God's going to wash his hands of this. It's not actually God that's telling a lie. I think that's really bad exegesis of this text. God is responsible for this also. Let's accept it for what it is. God is permitting deception to go to people who need the truth. Instead of hearing the truth, they're going to hear a lie. Well, obviously, we hear from the Micaiah story, they heard both. They heard the truth and they heard a lie. But God knows they're going to follow after the lie. Does that make God duplicitous? Does that make God complicit in deception, a participant in deception? Well, in a moral sense, no, it does not. And this is one of those, did Pharaoh harden his own heart, or did God harden Pharaoh's heart kind of situations here? And I refer to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 7 through 12. This is kind of the classic go-to text, as far as I'm concerned, with regard to God's participation in such things. Clearly, this much is true, and we knew this without God telling us, that God allows deception and lying to take place, including deception in matters of the spirit, matters of eternity. That's part of our life here on earth, to be subject to Satan's temptations, Satan's falsehoods, etc. Such was the case in the Garden of Eden. Why is it that Satan was allowed to lie to Adam and Eve? We can speculate about that all day long. The bottom line, though, is we are people of choice, and God will allow us to do the bad thing instead of the right thing if we are determined to do that. And I think that's the point of the Micaiah story. I think that's the point of the story here in 2 Thessalonians. If you skip down to verse number 7 or so, For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but the one now restraining will do so until he's out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed. The Lord Jesus will destroy him with the breath of his mouth and will bring him to nothing at the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is based on Satan's working with all kinds of false miracles, signs, and wonders, and with every wicked deception among those who are perishing. They perish because they did not accept the love of the truth and so be saved. We're going to come back to that. For this reason, because, again, they did not accept the love of the truth, for this reason, God sends them a strong delusion so they will believe the lie, so that they will be condemned, those who did not believe the truth but delighted in unrighteousness. Now, we could get sidetracked here and talk about whether this is talking about a specific individual in history or whether this is a characterization of evildoers in general or whatever. Let's just keep it to the context for right now, though. God will allow someone to come and tell a lie, knowing that certain people are going to believe the lie and be swept up in the lie and be deceived. Why is that the case? Because God doesn't love people? Because God doesn't care about the truth? No. He says so specifically here. He does this because people do not have a love for the truth. And, you can argue about God's parenting techniques all you want to, I suppose. But the bottom line is here, if you are determined to run away from home, God will let you do it. Just like the prodigal son. Why didn't the father stop the prodigal from running away? I don't know. I think there is at least this, that his son, like we as human beings under God's son, we are free moral agents. And if we are determined to destroy ourselves, God will allow us to do that. If he wanted us to be puppets, he would have made us puppets. He did not make us puppets. So what we need to do is find a way to embrace his truth instead of the truth that we are looking for, the truth that we want for ourselves. And that's the nature of these deceptions, whether it's talking about this Antichrist figure here, whether we're talking about Pharaoh or Ahab or any other person you may want to talk about who's dealing with these moral wrestlings, these doctrinal wrestlings. God's truth will ultimately prevail. God's truth only appeals, though, to the ones who love the truth, the ones who are willing to be drawn by the truth. And because of the nature of our dealings with sin and temptation here on earth, these factions that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 19, necessarily come up. They necessarily will come up and challenge us. Are you going to do the right thing, or are you going to do this other thing here? And sometimes it'll be a Diotrephes in the church who is encouraging you to go in the wrong direction. This working of delusion comes upon all kinds of people, including prophets in your own palace, as was the case with Ahab. What are you going to do in those moments? Well, it's going to depend on your character. It's going to depend on your connection, or lack thereof, to God and to God's truth. If you are pursuing God's truth, you don't have to worry about the worker of deception here. You don't have to worry about this fella coming around, because you're not drawn to that. You're only drawn to God's things. And if you want to find God's truth, God promises he will give you that truth. If we know anything at all about the power and the sovereignty and the provision of God, we know that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. He wants you to find the truth. He will bring you the truth, and he will empower you to listen to the truth if you want to, if you're inclined to. Now, we know from experience, we know from the Bible, that's not always the case. In fact, it's usually not the case. Does that mean the plan is broken? Does that mean that we need to go back to Ahab's plan of just kind of listening to the people that are more popular? Or are we going to double down on God's vision of truth? Are we going to embrace the idea that we are privileged to pursue truth and to embrace truth, and that we should revel in that truth and rejoice in that truth and hope in that truth? And obviously the latter is what I'm here talking about here today, that we need to listen to what God has to say and push back against the lies that we're going to find out there in the world. And lest you feel like you're in danger, as it were, I want to make sure that I reassure you. If you have a love for the truth, if you genuinely want to know what God has to say, if that's more important than feathering your own nest, if it's more important than your own personal popularity or success or comfort level or whatever it happens to be, if you want God's truth, God will find a way to get you the truth, and you'll be able to know the truth, and the truth will set you free, as John 8, verse 32 says. And this all culminates, of course, in the victory that God will accomplish for us. Ahab is only interested in victory. That's his only agenda, and God's fine with that. God would like Ahab to be successful in this life. But the only success he's going to find ultimately, and this is a great metaphor for us in our spiritual struggles, the only true success is found in God. And the conflict that we are engaged in here is not just a matter of politics and military strength and that sort of thing. It's not even primarily that. The struggle that we are engaged in as God's people is a spiritual one. And that should be, I think that's part of the reason why we have the story of the judges and the kings of Israel and all these great historical stories here, because the spiritual struggle and the physical struggle overlap extremely in a rather extreme sense in the Old Testament, because Israel, the people of God, are literally a tool in the hand of God to accomplish justice. God told Abraham way back in the day that he was going to have to wait 400 years because the sin of the Amorites wasn't completed. But when it was completed, and again, not because God didn't give him a chance to be saved, but because he was willing to let them go in their own way, the time was going to come for Abraham's descendants to come back into this land, the land of Canaan, and punish these wicked nations. And we see them driving out the Canaanites. Why was that the case? Because the Canaanites were wicked, because they were not worthy of this land. Not just that God had promised it to somebody else, you have to get out of the way. These are wicked people. Sodom and Gomorrah being maybe the most famous and maybe arguably at least the most extreme examples of this. These people are being punished by God, and the Israelites were a tool in his hand to do that. Now, we from a New Testament perspective should see this not as a model for physical warfare, but for spiritual warfare, that we are also tools in the hand of God to accomplish his spiritual purposes, not in a literal territory kind of way as it was back then, but in a spiritual way. That's the appeal that Paul makes here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And starting in verse number 1, now I, Paul, myself appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble among you in person, but bold toward you when absent. I beg you that when I am present, I will not need to be bold with the confidence by which I plan to challenge certain people who think we're behaving according to the flesh. People think that Paul is just in it for himself, basically. For although we live in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, since weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. We demolish arguments and every proud thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. And we are ready to punish any disobedience once your obedience is complete. Notice here that this is given to us in a context of Paul being accused of being selfish and prideful and arrogant about these kind of things. Paul says that's exactly the opposite. I'm not trying to get my way. I'm trying to get God's way. And those who are standing in my way, those who are preaching alternative gospels, who are gossiping about me behind my back, they're the ones who are not pursuing God's truth. They're the ones who are not fighting God's battles. If you are truly committed to spiritual things, if you are committed to spiritual warfare, this mission that Paul paints here for us, this destruction of arguments, this intellectual conflict, this intellectual exchange of ideas going on, trying to win hearts and souls, not by deception, not by force, but by persuading people. That's what our spiritual battle is all about. That is the sword of the Spirit. That's the word of God that Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 6, that is empowering us to do battle in God's name. It's not about conquering people. It's not about even winning from a personal standpoint. There are going to be a lot of conflicts that you engage in God's warfare, in God's battle, where you will be a righteous soldier of righteousness and have nothing said against you, that you will be conducting yourself, not perfectly, obviously, but nobly and trusting in God and fighting the good fight, and you'll fail. There will be a setback. The person will not listen to the gospel. They'll go their own way. Paul writes in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians about temples of God that are built with gold and silver and precious stones, and there are others that are built of wood, hay, and stubble. And when time of persecution comes up, the one may survive and the other one won't. That's not the prophet's fault. That's not the teacher's fault. That's just the way it is. And that's the way it's going to be with you also. What we need to have confidence in is if we will stand for the truth, like Micaiah did, if we will look into the halls of heaven and listen to what God has to say about salvation, about proper conduct, about worship, about organization, whatever he speaks to, whatever truth there is that he wants to share with us, we are going to be willing to accept and abide by that and put it to work in our lives and encourage other people to do the same. If you will do that, then spiritual victory will be yours. The one who endures to the end, this is the one that's going to be blessed. Revelation 14 and 13 talks about how blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Chapter 2 and verse 10, earlier in the letter to Smyrna, talks about the one who's faithful until death will receive the crown of life. If you will commit yourself to this struggle, if you will stand for the truth like Micaiah did, regardless of consequences, regardless of circumstances, regardless of the enemy that's allied against you, you can and you will be successful in your walk with Christ. This vision that we get into heavenly realms doesn't just show a God who is opposed to error and looking for ways to destroy his enemies. This is a vision of a God who respects and honors people like Micaiah, who are trying to do the right thing against ridiculous opposition. He honors these ones and he will reward these ones. Let's make sure that we are those ones in our life. Thank you very much for following along with this study. I hope that this is a blessing to you. I hope that you can continue to learn lessons from Micaiah and from similar stories in the Bible and draw closer to God every day. Thank you very much, and God bless.